This week might be the last. I know I said that last week, but seriously, this show might be coming to an end soon unless people like you, our viewers, can help us keep it going by becoming a patron. Go to patreon.com/actout and help us keep acting out. This week, break free from fossil fuels, rebel against the fracking infrastructure, glean some inspiration from our European anti-corporate coup comrades, and join the fight against lame ducks and their sneaky deals. Finally, Raed Jarrar has lived our Middle East policy and is now working to change it. But first, lunacy's loop, God and war. It's already a long story. But doesn't it feel as though it's just begun? The patterns that time has spun, repetitions made by follies of those seeking their fame, clutching to fortune, hoping to be saved, hoping to trade these hours and days for a promise of life, like the one that they gave. Irony clings to these spoils of life, the glimmers of logic struggle to light, the caves where our brains dig their own premature graves, accepting a fate on which they signed their name. Through silence, the violence, complicity, quiet, in line with the bias, a head-down reliance on God, war, and lying. We've been here before, God and war, this path too well traveled, dodging the corpses of those who believed or couldn't find means to leave and be free. A bend in the road, a few more, you're home, back where you started. A spiral disheartened, each lap is another sick layer of hate mixed with fear, the potent elixir that never runs dry. Sicker we die, a few voices cry, pushing to steer humanity's course far away from here. A jagged line juts out. From the circle of time, peace flickers, that logic glimmers, but clouds of the dutiful dying, the ones who find living a crime, then dig their murderous rage into children, the weak, the mentally caged, pouring the same poison we've tasted before. God and war. God and war. The jagged line smooths to the circle once more. God and war, God and war. Around the bend, making amends for evil that's past with a new sanctioned blast, righting our wrongs through the prongs of our lords. God and war, God and war. The stadium filled with mourners and fans, the brainwashed who know that this is our path, that outside this loop is lunacy, fools who dare to suggest our record be moved, that we could improve by trading some death for a life, a certain repetitive strife for something different. Better? Who knows? This loop is our coup, all that we know. The evolution of we has never been free to stray from the creed of God and war, God and war. The games still be played, but you know how they end, 'cause they never do. Here, death is the prize, a life on your knees, rise now to die. So then, why not try life outside? I cannot promise paradise, but riding on rings of a hellish repeat, this word simply uttered that sounds thrilling, sweet, different. Different from where we've all been before. God and war, God and war. We're rounding a bend, the past is now past, but the future could cast a different shadow than grave circles darkened by logicless caves, humanity's chance to actually save itself from the gods and the war it once looked to save. Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. There's quite a bit happening on the front lines this week, so let's get right to it. Happening now and upcoming, break free from fossil fuels, a global wave of civil disobedience specifically targeting some of the world's dirtiest energy projects. Last Tuesday, Break Free kicked off in Wales, where activists shut down the largest open-cast coal mine in the UK. Utilizing the red lines seen at the COP21 protests in Paris, activists donned red boiler suits and created a barrier to the mine, complete with red smoke grenades, huge signs reading "End coal," "No coal," and something that I'm assuming is in Welsh, but I will spare you all my attempt to say it out loud. The action was reminiscent of the Ende Gelände Ende Gelände action in Germany last year, where again, activists managed to shut down the largest open coal mine in Europe for a full day, which sounds like, well, no big deal. But when you consider that one day of an operational coal mine is equal to thousands of tons of greenhouse gases, every hour is powerful. And so right now, we are in the midst of the break-free push to repeat actions like the one in Wales and the one in Germany all over the world. Australia, Brazil, Canada, Germany again, Indonesia, New Zealand, Nigeria, South Africa, Turkey, and here in the US, from coast to coast. And if you're watching this in the US, check out usa.breakfree2016.org to get information on specific events in your area or to sign up as a digital witness to spread the word on whatever channels that you use. Now, moving on just slightly, let's take a look at this coming Sunday, the 15th. The 15th is not only the day that Break Free will hit the streets of DC, but in coalition with that event, Beyond Extreme Energy will be kicking off their Rubber Stamp Rebellion. Rubber Stamp Rebellion is a week-long action that focuses on the rubber stamping, or green lighting, of fracking and methane gas projects around the U.S. with absolutely no fucks given with regards to the environmental impact on people or planet. And although the core actions will take place at FERC in D.C., solidarity actions are being planned across the U.S. in frontline communities directly affected by fracking and fracking infrastructure, compressor stations, export terminals, and outside key Senate and House member offices. So, as it happens, wherever you are. Yeah, wherever the hell you are, there is a reason and a way to join in and call out the corporatized vandalization of public lands, private property, and people and planet in general. Get a few friends together, don some post-apocalyptic costumes, like these, for example, from the recent Duke Energy protest in North Carolina, and go make life difficult for the oil and gas barons in your neighborhood. I guarantee you there are some. To get more information or to get in touch with BXE about planning your own action, go to beyondextremeenergy.org. Now, before we move on to this week's interview, I'd like to take a moment to give everyone a boost of energy, a renewed sense of fuck yeah. This one especially goes out to all the naysayers, the doomsdayers who shrug when confronted with the concept of actually doing something about the wrong that you see in this world. You're not quite low-life scum, but you sure as shit are assholes. Instead of pulling people away from the fight, get out there yourself. Take all that energy that you expend on telling people it's useless, that they're useless, the fight is useless, and direct it towards making yourself useful. And although I feel that it's always a good time to call people out on their armchair apathy, the recent events in the EU surrounding TTIP offer up a perfect occasion to bring this up. For the past few weeks, literally hundreds of thousands of people, primarily in Germany, have marched in protest against this corporate coup trade deal, TTIP. If you're not familiar with it, think Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, but between the EU and the US. And if you're not familiar with the TPP, check out flushthetpp.org, or you can always... In the past few weeks, coalition organizations across the EU have staged protest against TTIP as talks move forward and heads of state pressured or were pressured to lay down some ink, effectively welcoming all the bad US ideas on everything from GMOs to environmental regulation into the EU, backed by corporate tribunals, ensuring that no European country could regulate against the interests of big multinational corporations. And that pissed people off plenty, even with EU commissioners promising that no trade deal could possibly threaten the EU's far stricter public health and environmental regulations. In fact, lawmakers were already starting to distance themselves from the toxic trade deal when along came the Greenpeace leaks. Last Monday, Greenpeace leaked documents that confirmed many Europeans' fears that TTIP is indeed only concerned with profit. Not at all with people or planet. The leaks also show that Uncle Sam would have the power to strong-arm the EU out of some of those common-sense regulations because money and because America. In that same vein, TTIP threatens to scrap existing regulation, such as the General Exceptions Rule, a 70-year-old regulation that ensures that cross-border trade deals are regulated in a manner that protects human, animal, and plant life, while preventing overconsumption of valuable natural resources. Makes sense? But another minor detail that's missing is the precautionary principle, a uniquely EU common sense regulation, once again, that requires risk analysis and policy intervention to be used in building a framework for environmental protection. In other words, without this precautionary principle, EU will open its borders to hazardous chemicals, GMOs, and really anything else that could damage human, plant, or animal life, while simultaneously resulting in a pretty profit for the asshat tycoons on high. The leaks also contain language such as market access for industrial goods and regulatory cooperation. Those basically translate to shut up, fuck you, import some damn coal, tar sands, methane gas, and oil, and stop complaining. These points and plenty others have only lit an even hotter fire under the already raging protests against TTIP. And following the leaks, French President François Hollande announced that he would reject TTIP as it stands because it goes against essential principles of the French way of life. And to be fair, far be it from me to suggest that you take a president at his word, but also realize that he wouldn't at all be up there saying this shit if it weren't for the tremendous show of people power. As Owen Jones wrote last week in his op-ed piece, European politicians and bureaucrats, quite rightly, would never have imagined that a trade agreement would inspire any interest, let alone mass protests. Symptomatic of their contempt for the people they supposedly exist to serve, the negotiations over the most important aspects of the treaty were conducted in secret. But rather than give up, activists across the continent organized. They toxified TTIP, forcing its designers on the defensive. Germany, the very heart of the European project, witnessed mass demonstrations with up to 250,000 people participating. From London to Warsaw, from Prague to Madrid, the anti-TTIP cause has marched. Members of the European Parliament have been subjected to passionate lobbying by angry citizens. Without this popular pressure, TTIP would have received little scrutiny and would surely have passed, with disastrous consequences. But as of right now, TTIP talks are stalled. EU lawmakers continue to shift uncomfortably in their thrones, and the people remain fucking pissed off. And the path from a shoe-in trade deal to a corporate coup on the rocks was certainly not paved by armchair apathetics, waving away resistance. It was paved by fucking hard work and determination, and the road is far from finished. In the coming months, those Europeans who have campaigned against TTIP should surely reach out to their American counterparts. Even if TTIP is defeated, we still live in a world in which major corporations often have greater power than nation states. Only organized movements that cross borders can have any hope of challenging this unaccountable dominance. From tax justice to climate change, the protest never achieves anything brigade have been proved wrong. Here's a potential victory to relish and build on. Couldn't, wouldn't, and didn't say it better myself, Owen, but allow me to expound on this call. Flush the TPP has been a powerful force in the U.S. fight against TPP and indeed other trade deals such as TTIP, and they are currently focused on the lame duck session, i.e. the session of Congress after the November elections, but before the new Congress comes in January. The reason for this is that accountability to voters, even more than usual, is at all-time lows during those few months. Members that are out still have a few months to fuck with things. Those that are in can take solace in knowing that we the people don't care and don't pay any attention after we've been inconvenienced with this whole pesky voting thing, and now need a few months to just rest and recuperate. That plus the fact that we have the memories of advanced Alzheimer's patients when it comes to political track records. So really, any decisions that are made at the beginning of a 2 to certainly 6-year term are unlikely to pose a threat when re-election time comes. So, given this climate of free-for-all governance, proponents of the TPP are way in favor of putting it up for a vote during the lame duck session. And having keyed in on this, Flush the TPP has already begun to plan actions against a lame duck TPP vote. Protests will take place in D.C. and across the country, so in order to stay tuned and get involved, visit flushthetpp.org/nolameduck. Now, moving on to this week's interview, we'll circle back to what I touched upon in today's spoken word, that sick, twisted circle of perpetual war. Raed Jarrar is the government relations manager in the Office of Public Policy and Advocacy at the American Friends Service Committee. That is a hefty title, but so is his experience in U.S. Middle East relations, not least of all from his own life. Last week, we sat down with Raed to talk about the U.S. addiction to conflict in the Middle East, the systems that are keeping the war machine running, and how he, a Palestinian Iraqi American, is working for all of his countries through diplomatic advocacy. Take a look. You're Palestinian and Iraqi, Sunni and Shiite. You lived in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Iraq, and you specialize in U.S. engagement in the Arab world. Is there anything that we're doing right?
No. The short answer is no. I think the U.S. engagement in the Middle East at large has been, it's been a story of failure for decades now. And whether it's regarding the U.S. indirect engagement through partners like Israel or some of the other regional countries, or whether it's through U.S. direct involvement, like what the U.S. did in Iraq in 1991 until today, or the U.S. involvement in Syria, it is a story of failure and destruction and death. That's what the U.S. role has been, unfortunately, in the region.
So, on that same note, in the book No Good Men Among the Living, Anand Gopal talks about the history of interventionism in Afghanistan and basically how they survived this sort of imperial culture by pitting sides against one another. And we have no idea what we're doing. We'll throw informants into Bagram or into Guantanamo. And essentially, the book is about how to destroy a country and make everyone hate you. And from what we've seen with the recent, there was a recent protest that got into the green zone in Baghdad, and you wrote a lot about this when you were living there as an architect that was trying to rebuild and seeing this on the ground. Is there any way to help at this point in Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria, or do we just need to get out because of our extreme ignorance of both culture and democracy?
Well, first let me point out an important detail, and that detail is Iraq and Afghanistan and other places that the U.S. has been interfering in have been destroyed because of U.S. intervention, but that wasn't necessarily because of a series of mistakes or ignorance. In many cases, that was the plan. So that's my caveat, is that many of these things happened on purpose. The destruction that happened in many of these countries was the plan. It wasn't despite the U.S. being there, it's because the U.S. was there. Now, regarding what to do about that, and that's of course a huge question of like what to do now. I've been always an advocate for ending interventions in Iraq and other parts of the region. I think getting out of the way is an important step, but at this stage, getting out of the way is not very easy because of two reasons. Number one, there is a huge void there that getting out of the way will end up leading to some aspects to collapse. And more importantly, getting out of the way should also include other powers who are interfering. So it's not only about the US getting out of the way. At this stage, it's about the US helping to broker a regional or even international deal so that other parties would also get out of the way. Some of the things can happen immediately, and these things that should happen immediately include us, number one, halting any weapon sales or transfers or aid to countries that have been abusing human rights. We don't have to fix them. We don't have to fly to Saudi Arabia and convince them to, not oppress women or allow women to drive. Or we don't have to go to Israel and advocate for ending the occupation. Yet, what we're talking about now is the immediate U.S. responsibility. We're sending U.S. tax dollars, money, to these countries, or we're selling U.S. weapons to these countries. And that could be stopped. It could be stopped overnight. And I think that should happen overnight. There was a really good report that came out a couple years ago, at the end of 2014, by the Congressional Research Service, CRS. And they looked into how much money the United States has spent on Iraq and Afghanistan since the beginning of wars, or since 9/11. The numbers are staggering, of course. They are in trillions of dollars. 1, 2, 3 trillion. God knows what that means. It's like a huge number with so many zeros, you know. But what's shocking about it is that 93% of the spending went through DOD. 93% went through the Department of Defense. And 3 or 4% went through the Department of State. And even that money that goes through the State Department is not that peaceful, you know, like Blackwater was employed by the State Department. But I'm saying as an engagement theory, imagine that as a country we're spending 93% of the money on bombs and 3% on, you know, what is supposed to be diplomacy. So there is no logic for the amount of money that the US spends. And of course, when you spend all of this much money on war, then you need something to spend it on. And that is why the machine, this is how the machine works. It has to produce bombs, it has to drop bombs on someone, and it has to have enemies. And when we don't have enemies, we have to find enemies. Sometimes the solution to some of these, you know, micro problems and you know, country specific issues actually have to do with our larger picture. Like, we will not be able to fix our engagement with Yemen or Syria or Iraq by just looking at that country. We need to take one step back and look at our the United States theory of engagement with the rest of the world.
So, final question. I'm curious because there's always this argument about, oh, you know, life under Hussein wasn't that bad, and then we came in and we made it so much worse. You've lived under Hussein. You've also lived under Bush. What do you feel? Do you feel that Hussein needed to be taken out? Do you feel that living under Bush was better or worse, or can we make those sort of distinctions?
I mean, I think a more accurate way to describe the contrast of what happened in 2003 is to see it as a moment where Iraqis used to live under national rule that started in the 1920s. There were multiple Iraqi governments and rulers since 1920. And then in 2003, Iraq was taken away by foreign rule. And the contrast is between having a foreign intervention and military occupation run the country as opposed to a national government that was run by Iraqis. Now, the answer to the question, did I believe that Saddam Hussein should have been removed, is yes. But the real question there is, who should have removed him? And that's where the complexity of the situation comes. Because the answer to the second question is not the US. So Iraqis managed to change many of these rulers in the last century. When the rulers got to a point where they were dysfunctional or corrupt or became dictators, there was a public mobilization that changed them. And when Iraqis did it, they did not burn their museums and loot their universities and destroy their infrastructure. They did it in a way that would remove the head of the political regime without impacting the civic part of the government. And Iraq historically was a socialist country. So the government owned, the public sector ran the country. The government owned most of the country. So, and it provided most of the basic needs to the people. When I grew up in Iraq, this public sector that was not invented or created by Saddam Hussein, it was inherited from the governments before. It was built by Iraqis, you know, from the time of my great-grandfather. And it was a very functional and very efficient system. So the country was functional in that fashion. And it had a political dictatorship that was brutal. Many people paid a heavy personal price, including my family. We had many members of my extended family who were killed by the government or had to flee the country by the government. And of course, we lived under that regime, and we knew that there were limitations for expression and political freedoms. There was one party that's allowed, etc. When the US came in, the US destroyed the political system there overnight. The political system in Iraq is corrupt, it's violent, and it does not allow for freedom of expression. And this is the system that was installed by the US. But more importantly, the US destroyed the rest of the Iraqi government. The public sector that used to provide to the public, they privatized it, bombed it, destroyed it. So Iraqis, in a way, they lost that safety net that was inherited from generations before. And they didn't gain a new political freedom, you know. What they gained is a new corrupt, dysfunctional sectarian system that continues to collapse until this day. People are not happy with the system. Iraq is the third or fourth most corrupt country in the world, according to Transparency International. Iraqis don't have any of the basic services that they need. There is no electricity or water that is reliable. Streets are in a bad situation. The education system has collapsed. The healthcare system has completely deteriorated. And Iraq is still one of the richest countries in the region, you know. So the contrast between what happened before, you know, April 2003 and after is striking in that regards, that when Iraqis had the chance to self-rule, they had problems, but they also had functional governance systems. And when the US went in and destroyed Iraq and destroyed Iraq's government, Iraqis lost both. They continue to have an oppressive regime that doesn't allow them to express their views, but they lost all of the safety networks that they used to have, all of the public sector that used to provide for them.
Due to the constraints of time, we have to leave you wanting more of that interview, which you can find online at our YouTube page and our Facebook page. And please, please, seriously do. Because as you heard, Raed's insight isn't only fascinating, it's fucking necessary. And with that, revolutionaries, I will say ta for this week. Please do spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know. Check out the last slide to see all of the sites that I mentioned in this week's show. And be sure to follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and subscribe on YouTube. From a beautiful day in the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, donate at Occupy.com/donate. If you'd like to donate directly to Act Out, visit Patreon.com/actout.